Again, these sort of broad categories are not helpful. You know what would be really helpful? Keeping track of organizations that historically have had ties to terror groups. That'd be a really good way of doing this sort of stuff. And it's exactly this sort of politically correct approach that is leading to the current breakdown in politics across the water over in the UK. So over the course of the break, Elon Musk went hard on Keir Starmer, who is the new Prime Minister of Great Britain. Starmer, of course, is the leader of the Labour Party. He was also a member of law enforcement during the time where law enforcement was largely ignoring these massive grooming gang cases about radical Muslims in Britain who were legitimately raping en masse white girls. It has been very well covered by the media now. It wasn't at the time. And the reason it was not covered well at the time, and it's been going on for decades, the reason it was not covered at the time was very obvious. And it openly stated was because for years, for literally decades, there were these groups of Muslim men who had been imported into the UK under the guise of multiculturalism, who had then begun to groom and rape 13, 14, 15-year-old girls. They'd set up these gangs to just pass these girls around. And the authorities full on knew about it. So did the media. They also knew about it. But there was one problem. They weren't going to report on any of this. The reason they weren't going to report on any of this is because there were far-right extremists who might take advantage of the messaging. This is the way that the politically correct left has decided to approach the problems with its own ideology, ignore them, pretend they don't exist, or pretend that the real problem is the people doing the noticing. That if you notice that there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of girls who are being raped by Muslim men in the UK, that if you notice that this is somehow a brand of your extremism, and we mustn't help the extremists to gain political power in Great Britain. Again, this is not me saying this. This is the journalists who covered the story. So, for example, the BBC did a documentary in 2017 called The Betrayed Girls. And they interviewed one of the journalists who really covered this thing in full in 2010. But he knew about this as early as 2002, 2003. His name is Andrew Norfolk. And here he is admitting full scale that the reason he did not cover what was called the Rochdale scandal is because he was afraid that it would lend credence to the British National Party or the English Defence League, both considered, quote unquote, far-right extremist organizations, for the great crime of saying, perhaps we shouldn't be importing into the West members of radical Islamic civilization.
The key point of the press release was that the men who were doing this to these girls were, I think the word used was from the Asian community. I spoke to Anne Cryer's researcher. She told me that the scale of this was far greater than they'd been able to say in the initial press release. They'd identified over 30 men who were involved. The idea of young girls, 13, 14, being befriended by lads who weren't much older than them initially and then introduced to a wider and wider circle of friends. The idea that this was in some way a collective activity, that girls were being passed around men. I'd not encountered anything like that before. I remember so clearly the feeling of how on earth do you report a story that is a fantasy for the far right. It's everything you could wish for if you're pushing a particular agenda. It's innocent white girls and it's evil, dark-skinned men.
The government's failure to control asylum and immigration was a force for bad.
Norfolk's fears were not without foundation. The BNP's vote in recent local elections had increased 300-fold in only 3 years, winning them seats on councils across northern towns. With the general election looming, immigration, race and asylum were key topics of the day.
Yes, it is true that we need to control immigration. Yes, it is important we discuss it, but it's an issue that should be dealt with, not exploited.
To my shame, I allowed my liberal fear about giving succour and credence to the British National Party to act as a brake on actually doing my job.
Okay, that's an amazing admission by one of the journalists who actually ended up breaking the story. But it wasn't just the journalistic institutions in the UK that decided to ignore this because it might lend credence to quote-unquote right-wing narratives about mass migration from radical Muslim countries. It wasn't just, it was members of authority. It was members of the police who not only looked the other way, they blamed the white girls themselves, suggesting that they had engaged in consensual activity, which is not even legal. They were like 13, 14, 15-year-old girls. And this carried on for literally decades. As Norfolk says, there were cases in which there were Muslim men who had raped white girls. Those white girls grew up and became moms, and later their own daughters would be raped by the children of the Muslim men. This is something that Andrew Norfolk says in this particular documentary. And the authorities ignored it for years. And it was only in 2013, 2014 that the authorities really started to take this very seriously. In 2014, there was a state commission report by a senior social worker named Alexis J., this is according to Politico, who found that some 1,400 vulnerable children were targeted and sexually abused in Rotherham alone between 1997 and 2013. That's not even in Rochdale, which is the story that was being covered in this particular BBC documentary. There are tons of towns all over Britain where this was happening. In Oldham, in Rochdale, in Rotherham, all over the place. And the politicians, the mainstream politicians, were absolutely complicit in all of this. They ignored it. They refused to take a look at it. In fact, even certain rare Labour MPs who actually attempted to cover this were shut down. So Elon Musk, over the weekend, he went after Keir Starmer. And the reason he went after Keir Starmer is because there was a request that there be a federal investigation in Britain into a national investigation into these grooming gangs, a national inquiry. And Starmer's Labour government rejected that, instead pointing to a series of existing inquiries on the issue and a 2022 report whose findings are still being implemented. And Musk immediately went after Starmer, and he suggested that Starmer was complicit because Starmer, of course, was involved in the Crown Prosecution Service at the time that a lot of this was going on. He called him despicable and said he was, quote, deeply complicit in the mass rapes in exchange for votes. And again, this is a party. This is, in fact, a party, the Labour Party, that has been complicit in the attempts, if not actually guilty of the attempts, to cover up crimes related to the failures of multiculturalism in Britain. Remember, I mean, it's Sadiq Khan, who's the mayor of London, who's openly calling for the criminalization of quote-unquote Islamophobic speech. He's a member of the Labour government. Here he was this year.
One of the things that is coming up over and over again is Islamophobia. And, well, you can see the stats, you can see the numbers rising, particularly since October the 7th. Although we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that before October the 7th, this was all heading in the right direction. It's been far too high for far too long. Clearly, we need to just say over and over again, Islamophobia is intolerable.
That's Keir Starmer, by the way.
It can never, ever be justified. And we have to continue with a zero tolerance approach. And I think there's more we can do in government. There's certainly stuff online, which I think needs tackling much more robustly than it is at the moment.
What I'm hoping, Keir, is your experience as a prosecutor means you'll be thinking about the strategy we can use to make sure we take action against those who break the law.
Okay, that is the most Orwellian crap I have ever heard. I mean, truly Orwellian in Great Britain. That's Keir Starmer, who is the current prime minister, talking to the mayor of London about criminalizing Islamophobia. What are the things you can do as a former prosecutor, says Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, to criminalize Islamophobia, which Keir Starmer says has risen dramatically in the aftermath of October 7th, which, as you will recall, was a mass Islamic terror attack on Jews. Hey, this is where the Labour Party is. You want to know why there's this massive right-wing backlash happening all over the globe, particularly with regard to immigration? This would be the reason, because mass migration has not been a boon to the West, not in the modern era. Mass migration is a massive problem because it has been combined not with assimilation, not with economic growth, but with economic stagnation and non-assimilation. And it has been biased toward countries that are exporting people who have no interest in assimilating to Western values, and in fact, many of whom despise Western values. And if you say that sort of stuff out loud in the UK, apparently you get arrested. There's a better shot you'll get arrested in the UK for saying something quote unquote Islamophobic than apparently for raping white girls if you're a radical Muslim. That seems to be the logic over in the UK and has been for quite a while. Where Keir Starmer has yelled at Elon Musk, now he's very angry because Elon Musk attacked him. And so he says that Elon Musk is now a member of the far right. Again, this is the labeling process. What really despicable. And by the way, where's the Conservative Party in the UK on all this? Because this wasn't just a Labour problem. This is a Tory problem in the UK. Where are the people who are willing to stand up and say the truth? There's been a lot of talk about Tommy Robinson, who's in jail. And he has said some very true things on this. And Tommy Robinson has his own sort of checkered history as to saying certain things that are not true. But he is right on this, and he has been right on this particular issue as a general matter, and that's the reason that he has been targeted by law enforcement. All this other stuff has been ginned up. In any case, here is Keir Starmer responding to Elon Musk.
And when politicians, and I mean politicians, who sat in government for many years, are casual about honesty, decency, truth, and the rule of law, calling for inquiries because they want to jump on a bandwagon of the far right, then that affects politics, because a robust debate can only be based on the true facts.
It's only based on the true facts, says Keir Starmer. The facts that you are not allowed to acknowledge in Great Britain.